Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's March 7th, 2026. Oil moved more than it has in any single 24-hour period in the measured monetary history of the black gold yesterday. That, on its own, seems like a divergence from the fallout of what happened with the Venezuelan leadership assassination strike that the Trump administration executed a couple of months ago. But if we want to steelman the tactical plans that the administration is following, then decapitating the antagonistic leadership of Venezuela and presumably putting it in friendlier hands, or at least in the hands of someone that the American empire feels that it can work with and who will play ball when Maduro would not. Having Venezuela, the country with the largest proven oil reserves in the world, taking control of that a couple of months ahead of the Iran attack, where the not particularly surprising fallout has been a massive increase in oil prices, does make quite a bit of strategic sense. Dispositionally, I don't like the interventionism, and the recent history of American interventionism over the last couple of generations has been disastrous, to put it mildly, at least for the well-being of middle Americans and for the masses of populations on the receiving end of American imperial ambitions. But I have to admit that it does look like the targeting assassination methods of this second Trump administration is, at least at this point, much preferable to the neoconnery and the neoliberalism that came before, with George Bush, W. Bush, and Obama blowing up Iraq and Afghanistan, respectively, and then Libya and Syria, and the refugee fallout that came from that, and the American blood and treasure that was spilled as a result of putting boots on the ground and getting into these drawn out, for a lack of a better term, forever wars. With Maduro arrested and Khomeini dead, Trump realistically is going to be able to scare a lot of world leaders into doing what he wants, because the mafia-esque threat is very real. Play ball with us or we'll kill you, and we'll do it without having to wage an internal media campaign. We'll do it quickly, and we'll do it even if 80% of our population opposes it. We'll do it, and before anyone is able to marshal any kind of effective resistance, whether it be through media or some international conglomerate like the UN, or through congressional or judicial opposition. While I very much sympathize with the anti-war opposition domestically, as was mentioned just a minute ago, there is a concern that they get over their skis in being overly histrionic about the consequences of this latest military action against Iran. It's not for nothing that the neocon Zionist elements that are the strongest supporters of the second Trump administration currently, like the Ted Cruzes and the Lindsey Grahams of the world, are rhetorically putting so much emphasis on how people like Tucker Carlson were wrong about the first attack on Iran and the consequences, devastating consequences that he predicted. And there's a risk of something similar, a similar dynamic playing out again. And that really is the only leg of popular support the neocons in and around the Trump administration have, because Americans don't want this war, but if it goes much better than a lot of those who are opposed to it anticipate that it will, then it steals the thunder of the anti-war right, the populist MAGA right, and puts the Zionist neocons in the driver's seat. It really ensconces them in that position. Now, with that being said, there has already been some kinetic consequences of this second Trump administration's second attack on Iran that are a lot more consequential than what happened the first time around. And that is still being not widely reported, but while there hasn't been many confirmed American casualties, very few up to this point. There has been casualties in allied Sunni Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. And there have been plenty of anecdotal, if officially unconfirmed, reports of American casualties. Right now, as we record, the official number that's been released is 6. And the cliche about every American death being a tragedy exists because there is truth to it, but there are over 100 people that die in the United States in vehicular accidents every day of the year. And so 6 American soldiers, people in the armed forces, one of the more dangerous jobs in the United States, giving the ultimate sacrifice, if that is the extent or representative of the extent of American blood that's spilled in the Iran attack, trying to undermine the moral case for the attack by referencing American lives lost is not going to be a particularly fruitful avenue to take. I have to caveat that with a personal anecdote of my own. Someone I work with has a cousin who is deployed in Iraq, and the base where he was stationed when the attack on Iran took place was hit by missile fire from Iran, presumably from Iran, and his unit, all of the American military personnel at that base left and had to go radio silent on any sort of social media or cell phone communication with the outside world, such that this employee was worried that her cousin had been killed because no one in the family heard from him for over 48 hours. And so these attacks, and there are lots of other, again, unconfirmed stories that are similar, those attacks, however they are coming about and whatever the command structure is that's launching them, it shows a difference in the approach that the U.S. and Israel took in Venezuela versus in Iran. In the case of Venezuela, by executing that pinpoint strike, the United States was able to effectively commandeer, or at least to paint it as rosily as possible, it looks like the American military empire was able to commandeer Venezuela, at least for meaningful interactions with the United States, in a way that killing Khomeini and allowing whatever command support structure has been set up in the last years and decades of Iran's existence as a state that Israel has in its crosshairs, that command structure was able to go into action in such a way that it doesn't seem evident that America and Israel are going to be able to now threaten some other leaders in the command structure of Iran to get them to do the American-Israeli Zionist bidding in the same way that the American empire was able to get Venezuela to do so. And that could be because the ultimate intention of this Iran attack is to do something similar to Iran that was done to Iraq and to Syria and to a lesser extent Egypt, that Israel would like to do to Lebanon, and that is to essentially render the place a dysfunctional state that can't meaningfully resist Israel's expansionist intentions in the Middle East. Even if the consequences to the West are minimal in terms of blood and treasure spilled in the attack on Iran, and even if Israel effectively gets what it wants, which is Iran more or less becomes a state that no longer exists, it breaks up into various ethnic groups, and whatever the threat of the Persians obtaining some sort of nuclear weapon capability to threaten Israel, whatever that is, or whatever existed prior to this attack, which we've heard Bibi Netanyahu talk about for 30 years, how Iran is just 6 months away from a nuclear weapon, and yet never has Iran actually gotten to anything really close to nuclear weapon capacity. Whatever that overblown threat was over the last several decades, well, if Iran collapses into this warring, factional, internecine geographic area that no longer can really be described as a state in it or a nation in any functioning sense. Whatever that missile threat, nuclear threat was previously, it will be much reduced even from that. But even if that does end up being the case here, it is important to understand that the pinpoint strike in Venezuela and taking out Iran, those two things, while they may represent a cleaner, less costly set of nation-building enterprises by the American empire compared to the Iraq and Afghanistan wars that dragged on at the cost of trillions and trillions of dollars and thousands of American dead and hundreds of thousands of Iraqi and Afghani dead. That even if these things are cleaner, that does not mean that this is a strategy that can be against other perceived adversaries of the American empire like Russia and China. Richard Lynn, in his book IQ and the Wealth of Nations, estimates the average IQ of Iran at 84. Reading from the abstract of a paper published in PubMed through the NIH and the National Library of Medicine, quote, "Consanguineous marriage is a major feature of family systems in Southwest Asia. The aim of the present study was to determine the current prevalence and patterns of consanguinity in Iran as a means of assessing the associated requirement for genetic counseling services." Parenthetically, that is a big concern in Europe, where migration patterns over the last decades have led to a demographic transition in Western Europe, where there are lots of people from regions where interbreeding is a culturally accepted practice. It is largely the norm, or at least not something that's aberrational, and there are a lot of consequences that come from marrying and procreating with people who are so genetically similar to you. Consanguinity is a fancy term for breeding with other members of one's own family. So con, as a prefix, means together, and sanguine means blood. And so it is literally translated bringing together the same blood. And so a lot of attention is given in places like France and Germany and Great Britain to the deleterious social effects of these consanguineous unions that are common among the immigrant underclass, in much the same way that we can recognize here in the United States how people will talk about the single mother households as a way of sort of euphemizing the social dysfunction of the American underclass, in particular blacks in the U.S. So a similar dynamic is in play with Turks and Syrians and Iraqis in Europe. And so that's how a paper like this is able to be published in a prestigious journal and funded by the NIH, because it's being done to ameliorate the consequences of certain cultural practices that are deemed to create problems. And of course they do create real problems. Although even this approach, this trying to get at the cultural issues, is something that's becoming increasingly politically and culturally difficult to do. It used to be sort of the neoliberal approach to problems of integration and diversity, such as they were just issues with some cultural practices that with proper education could be fixed, and then the whole melting pot thing would work, because to the extent people are different at all, it's just that they have different cultural practices, but there are no underlying biological differences between groups of people, between different populations. And even that approach, that cultural approach, is now becoming something that's increasingly difficult to do. And the approach increasingly now is to say that these are just cultural differences and it's bigoted and othering to act like this is some sort of problem when it's just a different choice, a different lifestyle, a different culture. But whatever the pretty little lies that are spun to assist the demographic transformation of the West and allow non-white pathologies to flourish, the underlying reality still matters. And that underlying reality, that the average IQ in Iran is in the mid-80s, which is comparable to that of blacks in the United States, and that the consanguinity rate in Iran is high, such that it creates not just genetic problems, but also makes very westernized concepts like fair play and objective systems of democracy effectively impossible, because families are so tribalistically closely related to one another and correspondingly not outbred, and so not nearly as invested in the broader, wider society, that those things paired with decades now of crippling economic sanctions and Western soft power being used to isolate Iran as much as possible from the global economy, that all of these things, this confluence of factors, is why the American military empire is able to take out Iran. But that is not going to be, those set of circumstances do not apply to Russia or to China. So a low IQ, inbred, theocratic, economically isolated country like Iran, but high IQ societies like Russia and China that are, especially in the case of China, much more homogenous and have a massive industrial base of their own and are far more integrated into the global economy. Not to mention having a population that is almost 15 times as large as Iran's, that thinking that the next domino to fall can be one of these big adversaries because Venezuela got knocked out, Iran got knocked out, maybe Cuba will get knocked out. That I am confident in saying, even more confident than Tucker Carlson was in saying that the first attack on Iran would have a bunch of negative consequences for the United States, that the American empire trying to execute something like what's happened in Venezuela or Iran against Russia or China really will bring on the Third World War. And the consequences will be much, much more dire than any economic fallout or American casualty count from what's going on in Iran now. And as is my wont, I got into a digression there. I didn't even finish reading the abstract about the consanguinity in Iran. So picking up again from that abstract, the overall rate of consanguineous marriage was 38.6%. First cousin marriages were the most common form of consanguineous union, with parallel patrilateral marriage especially favored, so that is between the offspring of two brothers, the brothers' offspring marrying one another. That is, the first cousin marriages are 27.9% of all marriages in Iran. That is, more than 1 in 4 is to a first cousin or closer, with even closer than cousin, first cousin being like an uncle marrying a niece or half siblings marrying one another. That is more than 1 in 4 of the marriages in Iran. In contrast, in the United States, about 0.2% of all marriages are between individuals who are second cousins or closer. And that second cousin or closer figure refers to people who share at least one great grandparent. That is what makes you a second cousin with someone, is that you share a great grandparent. If you share a grandparent, then you're a first cousin. And so, again, in Iran, we talked about how first cousin marriages were 27% of the population, but consanguineous marriages, which are second cousin or closer, were over 38%. So over 38%, that is more than 1 in 3, are to a second cousin or closer, whereas in the United States, that figure at 0.2% represents just 1 in 500. And as an aside, that 1 in 500 figure might evoke images of banjo playing Appalachians from movies like Deliverance or jokes about Arkansas, but in reality, even that 1 in 500 is probably disproportionately due to recent immigration into the United States. The Western taboo on interbreeding is such that most Westerners just assume that it's some sort of bigoted slur to imply that much of the rest of the world has no problem with cousins marrying one another, and in fact often encourages it for financial and family unification reasons. But this was a dissident right talking point prior to the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. The idea that some sort of Jeffersonian democracy was going to be able to be installed in these countries after the Taliban and the Baathists, respectively, were knocked out was recognized instantaneously as absurd because of the high rates of consanguinity that made representative democracy at a large scale, and a scale much larger than a Dunbar number of 150, 200, 250 people, basically a tribe, a village. Anything beyond that level of representation was going to be effectively impossible. It was going to be racked with corruption and fraud and mistrust and a total inability to operate any sort of organization at scale. And the last 25 years has borne that out, has vindicated that dissonant right concern. In the case of Afghanistan, it was never anything more than theocratic tribalism. To the extent that Afghanistan existed over the last 25 years, it was because, and only because, of perpetual Western infusions of resources and population control. And as soon as the West pulled out of Afghanistan, it immediately reverted to that tribalistic, theocratic, consanguineous type of society. And in the case of Iraq, what exists there now is closer to Afghanistan 25 years ago, or even Afghanistan today, than it was prior to America's invasion, when the secular and very authoritarian Ba'athist regime ruled with an iron fist. But in both places, neither prior to the American-led invasion or after the consequences had accrued for decades, in both cases, in both places, both periods of time, and any time before, any time subsequent, never was anything like a representative democracy with an open society that is heralded as the aspirational thing in the Western world. Never was that on the menu as a realistic possibility. The dissident right understood this. The neocon right either didn't or pretended not to. And at the time of the Iraq and Afghanistan invasions, that neocon side of the right was in total control, total ascendancy. That was all that was available in corporate media or even mainstream conservatism to a large degree. And so that's a good enough segue into an observation made here previously, that there is a real convergence between the mainstream right and the dissident right. And that's, to say it's a convergence isn't accurate. That makes it sound like there was some sort of Hegelian synthesis that occurred where the dissident right and the mainstream right in America came together. But really what it is that the mainstream right outside of the neocons, that while they have control of the Trump administration seemingly and are still represented on outlets like Fox News in terms of popular support, are very much on the outs. So think of somebody like Rush Limbaugh 20 years ago as representing the mainstream grassroots right. Well, he was a lot more in line with the neoconnery that would be displayed on places like Fox News or the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal than he would be in agreement with the dissident right. But now the most popular influencers on the mainstream right, people like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens, Matt Walsh, they in many ways sound indistinguishable from what was written in obscure and disreputable and disrespected outlets like VDare or American Renaissance. And yet now they sound virtually identical. In other words, the dissident right has won the rhetorical battle on the right, on the popular right in America. And this was illustrated very apparently in the coverage that Kevin Deanna of American Renaissance, who used to use the pen names of Gregory Hood at American Renaissance and James Kirkpatrick at VDare, at the late and now defunct VDare, how he covered the collapse in a sewage pipeline outside of Washington, D.C. in Maryland that spilled infinity billion tons of sewage into the Potomac River, how he covered it and how Matt Walsh of the Daily Wire covered it. And you can see them for their respective takes on the story. The TLDR is that DEI put into place unqualified blacks in positions of authority, and those blacks in positions of authority use that authority to bring in more unqualified non-whites. And as a consequence, residents of the DC metro area experience the same sort of infrastructure collapse that would be recognizable in South Africa or in Flint, Michigan, or in so many other urban areas you'll only hear about locally, but that you are able to trace by looking at population transfers like in Detroit or Cleveland or St. Louis, where the effective and competent white population has left or been run out of town and has been replaced by incompetent political appointees who exist in their positions of power for the sole purpose of political patronage and taking the resources that come with their position to dole out benefits to other friends and political allies. And this rupture and the spill and the attendant health problems that manifest from it that may not be fully appreciated yet, probably are not even close to fully appreciated yet. This initial burst happened 6 weeks ago, yet repairs are still underway, ongoing, and quite a ways away from full resolution. Reading from DC News Now. The repairs made to the Potomac interceptor that resulted in the January 19th sewer line collapse reached the halfway mark Friday, according to DC Water. DC Water stated that the upstream section of the interceptor has been repaired, with a full restoration expected to be complete by mid-March. In addition to the interceptor repairs, crews have begun environmental rehabilitation efforts, with the first phase of cleaning up the area near the collapse site reaching 15% completion. This process includes soil scraping, excavation, installation of temporary erosion control matting, and removal of contaminated soil and vegetation. DC Water said crews are working with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the EPA, the National Park Service, and the Maryland Department of the Environment to manage the river, channel, and shoreline. District officials lifted their recreational water advisory restrictions on Monday, while the Virginia and Maryland Departments of Health issued partial lifts for the lower parts of the river on Thursday. And so even with multiple federal agencies involved, we're almost 2 months out, and the thing is still in the process of being cleaned up. This is raw sewage being spilled in the Potomac River that runs right through the heart of the imperial city. I'll confess to a bit of schadenfreude, and it probably doesn't reflect particularly well on me, but if I can't be honest here, where can I be honest? Poisoning an enemy that we can't beat outright in any sort of direct confrontation, it made this play in my head. But it is definitely cope to imagine that this is going to somehow chastise the managerial state into seeing that the demographic transformation that is taking place in the Western world is something that the natives, in the case of the United States, is something that heritage Americans will eventually rise up against and refuse to tolerate any longer. The reality is that it's baked into the demographic transformation that there will be a greater democratic acceptance of deteriorating standards of living and quality of life, because these new Americans are much more acclimated to living in squalor and accepting it as the way things are. Springfield, Ohio, where stray cats get eaten, or Minneapolis, where leering centers educate ghost children. These places now, even as they deteriorate, are much better than Haiti. DC, with feces in the water, is still a lot better than post-Rhodesian Zimbabwe. And for any of the good swipples who wear the pride flags and celebrates diversity and track down ICE agents on signal, who have the temerity to voice some concerns about the deterioration that the political actions they so strongly support inevitably bring with them. For those people, there are terms like the Karen slur. It's a manifestation of the system keeping status-striving whites who, at least in the short term, are able to benefit by riding the heritage American grinding into dust to their own benefit. These are the Jacob Frey types and the Tim Walz types, the mayor of Minneapolis and lame duck governor of Minnesota, respectively. The terms like Karen and the cultural force that makes them work, we will see those things employed ever more effectively and acutely as the demographic transition continues. Apropos that black pill observation that the demographic transformation is not going to be met with much resistance in the United States and the Western world more broadly. From the Economist YouGov, a poll asking, quote, overall, do you think having an increasing number of people of many different races, ethnic groups, and nationalities makes the U.S. a better place or a worse place to live, or doesn't make much difference either way, unquote. By a significant degree, a plurality say that it makes the United States a better place to live at 45%. Just 17% say it makes America a worse place to live. So by a 3-to-1 margin, Americans say making America less white makes America better. And there are really no bones to be made about it. If you're talking about increasing the number of people of different races and ethnic groups and nationalities, you are, of course, talking about making America, which is still a majority white country, less white. Even among Trump supporters, 27% say it makes America a better place to live, 34% a worse place to live. So if we take a net of the better versus worse and disregard those who say it doesn't make much of a difference or aren't sure, in the case of Trump voters, it is diversity gets a net negative 7 points. In comparison, among Harris voters in the 2024 election, 75% say it makes the country a better place to live and just 5% a worse place to live. So if we have anti-diversity in the U.S. sentiment among Trump voters as a -7, we have that sentiment among Harris voters in favor of diversification of the United States at a +70. So 10 times as much strength in favoring diversity and the reduction of the white population in America among Harris voters as there is opposition to that among Trump voters. As a heritage American, this is depressing, if not unexpected, but it's an observation of reality, and that reality is white Americans, those who putatively, at least from this heritage American's perspective, stand to lose from this transformation, from the de-whitening of the Western world, that most whites themselves have no problem with this. If we look at whites in particular in the poll for this question, 43% of whites say it makes America a better place to live, just 22% a worse place to live. So by a 2-to-1 margin, whites think that making America less white makes America better. So we can blame outbreeding, we can blame our heritage of Christianity, we can blame the culture of critique. But ultimately, this blame lies with us because, almost paradoxically, we are so willing to accept blame and to accept the framing of those who would blame us, because often it is us doing that framing, or at least going along with it. Can you imagine a result remotely like this in China or in Nigeria? Of course you cannot, but you can imagine it in other European diasporas, in Western Europe, in Australia, in New Zealand, in Canada. It is depressingly difficult to see how a population that is not just at peace, but to a large extent celebrates its own replacement, how that population replacement can hope to be prevented, reversed, or even effectively slowed. On a less politically contentious, but possibly even more existentially meaningful note, the guys on the State of the Arc podcast, which is one that Jeff turned me on to, were recently talking about the state of virtual reality. In this context, having to do with video gaming. They do analysis on the state of the arc of the narratives, the storytelling methods and mechanisms and presentation of video games and other popular media like movies and television series. But what interests me in particular in this discussion was a guest that they had on who was describing using the latest VR technology. I forget if it was from Microsoft or from Facebook's Meta. The players pushing the cutting edge of this technology is not something that I am particularly familiar with. Forgive not being able to recall which VR headset was being used, but the guest was describing how he had literally fallen over because the experience was so immersive that in the VR world that he was inhabiting, in a first-person shooter setting, that he leaned up against a virtual wall and forgot that it was virtual and literally fell down because there was nothing there restraining him like he thought there would be. That observation struck me as additional confirmation of how, if simulations are conceivably possible, fully immersive simulations are possible, we are virtually certainly in one right now. That immersion is where people want to be. I take my girls to gymnastics and I watch them doing their thing while everyone else, all the other parents, are staring into their phones, into the gourd, to use a Piers Anthony Xanthian early critical conception of the problem that virtual reality presents humanity. In the Xanthian fantasy novels, people would look into a gourd which would transport them to this virtual world that in many ways was enhanced and more pleasurable and more enjoyable than the actual world, and so they would become effectively paralyzed and totally incapacitated in the real world because they were stuck in that virtual world. Well, people will do that with cell phones, and people will celebrate technology that's immersive enough that it causes them to fall in the real world because they like the virtual world being so realistic. As that technology progresses, why would we not get to a point where it became increasingly, exponentially more immersive? The guest on the State of the Arc podcast was celebrating the fact that he fell, with the joking about how you do have to be a little bit careful because you don't want to physically hurt yourself. This was reported as a feature, not at all as a bug. This was showing how far the technology had gone, and it was recommending the technology as such because of its immersive capacity. Well, we take that principle to its logical conclusion, and why, instead of just being tricked about walls, why wouldn't you want to be tricked about everything? Why wouldn't you want to create an entire immersive world that you got to become fully engaged in, because that's what enhanced the experience so much? And so if you could have all the fun, such as it is, or existential delight, whatever it is that causes people to seek out this virtual world in the first place, if you can have all the benefits that accrue therein without real world risks, even if you can fool yourself into thinking there are real world risks, if there aren't real world risks because you're in a simulation, why would you not do that? It's a rhetorical question. I don't have a good answer. Maybe it's because I'm just talking to simulated reality anyway, and so it doesn't really matter. And so maybe I'm breaking the fourth wall in my own simulation, and it's time for me to move into another one. And if we are going to move into other simulations, I would love to be shifted over to the Xanthian world right about now. The way I'm really attached to my wife and children, so they need to come with me. Speaking of kids, my son's basketball team last weekend had a tournament, and they were in the semifinals. With 5 seconds left, my son hit a shot just inside the arc with 5 seconds remaining to tie the game up and take them into overtime. They ended up winning in overtime and were headed to the finals an hour later. It was one of those parental vicarious moments of joy that will stick with me forever. Even though an hour later, when they played in the championship, they got trounced by a team that beat them by 20 points, although in fairness to my son's team, that was the closest game that team had all season, according to their own coach. And the reason it was such a blowout is because this team had 3 gargantuan players who were the height of average adult men in America playing against prepubescent boys. Later that day, I was talking to a neighbor whose son is competing at the state level in high school wrestling for a weight class of 133, 132. Looking at the National Federation of High School Wrestling, it looks like it's 132, so 132 to 138 pound weight class. Looking at that NFHS site, I see that there are 14 different weight classes for high school wrestling, because no matter how skilled and strong and compact a kid is, if he weighs 120 pounds and he goes to wrestle someone who weighs 220 pounds, well, there are rules of physics that just are what they are. And if that 220 pound wrestler is even moderately competent, he's going to mop the floor with the best wrestler on the planet who weighs 120 pounds. So this reality exists, this observation of reality exists when it comes to wrestling. These are not adults, these are children, kids in school who would have the sport ruined if they didn't make parameters based on biological realities, because if these weight classes didn't exist, then there wouldn't be any skill and training and technique. All of that would be thrown by the wayside, because it would just be tonnage, raw poundage that would matter. Maybe not technically exclusively. You could imagine some kid with a 40% body percentage, way out of shape, who, even though he has 100 pounds on someone else, loses. But if you're talking about someone who is just moderately competent, who weighs 100 pounds more, moderately competent and in good shape, who weighs 100 pounds more than someone else, then all of the technique and the strategizing and the practice and the hard work and all of these other things are just instantly negated by the reality of the weight difference. Something similar is at play with the dynamics in basketball. My son's team is very well coached. They run a sophisticated offense and defense. They have different plays and all sorts of different audibles that they practice rigorously. And even watching the championship game, it was clear that my son's team was far more technically skilled than the team that trounced them. But my son's team couldn't move the ball outside of the arc. The only option was to try to hit threes, which is tough to do for elementary school kids because they couldn't get a shot off inside the paint. And the other team, to the extent that they had an offense at all, it was have the guard throw it to a center, one of the forwards, one of these kids who was a head and a half taller than anyone on my son's team, just throw it to them and let them shoot over and over short shots where if they missed, they just stuck their hands up and got the rebound. And it's not like this is just a dynamic at play among elementary school kids. The mean height of an NBA player in America is 6'7". That puts them 3 standard deviations above the average height for men in America. That is, they're at the 99.7 percentile, and that is the average. So there are as many people in the NBA who are taller than 6'7" as there are who are under 6'7". The 99.7th percentile means 1 out of 300 people are taller than the average NBA player, and that average NBA player is taller than 299 out of 300. And so while there are the freaks of nature like the John Stocktons who have a place, who can play basketball, albeit only in one particular position, they can only be guards. It's totally inconceivable that they'd be forwards, power forwards, or centers or anything like that. But even in the case of a guard, the average NBA guard is almost 6'5", so that puts them over 2 standard deviations above the mean. So the position that is the most skilled, least contingent upon height for feasibility to play at a high level is at the 98th percentile of height. And so effectively in basketball, you have, if you're tall, you have this universe that exists separate from the vast majority of the rest of the population in terms of being able to compete. And of course, those tall people should not be punished for being genetically gifted when it comes to their height. But if the purpose of sports competitions is just that, competition, and that's something that's recognized in wrestling, then why not in basketball? Because as important as weight is in determining viability in wrestling, height is probably even more determinative of viability in basketball. Or maybe I should stop whining. The answer is just to get better, or in the case of my son's basketball team, get taller. That'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next time.